Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Kaposy. As Eloise mentioned, I'm speaking about restricting access to prenatal genetic information because it's discriminatory. And by the way, thank you, Eloise, for the very nice introduction. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Though I'm not with you in Oxford, I wish I was. I am, however, presenting from, as Eloise mentioned, the island of Newfoundland in Canada. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the land from which I present as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and also that the island of Newfoundland is the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk. We strive for respectful relationships with all peoples of my home province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. Even though this presentation isn't about Indigenous peoples or about reconciliation and sharing the land, I do believe that all pursuits of justice are connected. So I hope in some small way, by seeking justice in along the lines that we're discussing here today, will contribute to justice in other areas. So I'd like to begin with an overview of my presentation. To start off, I'd like to provide some context. First of all, about some new technologies that are going to be available in the future for providing genetic information at the prenatal stage. And I want us to think broadly about the ethical implications about these new genetic technologies. So first of all, non-invasive prenatal whole genome sequencing, and as well polygenic scoring. I also want to look at some of the different access points in the genetic information timeline. So if we're talking about restricting genetic access to genetic information, then there's different ways of doing it. And I want to look at some of those different ways. Furthermore, I also want to think about some of the different groups that are involved in this timeline of producing and accessing prenatal genetic information and also acting on it. Because if we're speaking about restricting access on the basis of discrimination, then we need to think about who has control of that information in the first place. And from there, I want to look at some ethical reasons for restricting access, and notably focusing in on ethical reasons that have to do with discrimination. And I want to advance an argument, or the beginnings of an argument, that the ethical justification for accessing prenatal genetic information in the first place often or usually corresponds to medicalization of that information. And towards the end of the presentation, you'll see what I mean, I think. In general, Down syndrome is a condition in particular that I'll be kind of focusing on. It'll be in the background for the first little bit, but it'll come to the fore towards the end of the presentation. Okay, so to begin with some context about genetic information and new technologies. So there's been some discussion in recent years about the possibility that we will soon have access to non-invasive prenatal whole genome sequencing. And ethicists have already been speaking and publishing about some of the ethical implications of this new technology. So it's sort of like NIPT, but rather than just targeting a few conditions, there's a possibility that this technology, along with others in the future, may enable prospective parents to have access to all genetic information about their fetus. So a vast amount of complex genetic information early in pregnancy. And so these authors, Chen and Wasserman, have described this possibility as opening a Pandora's box of genetic information. What that means is it's enormously complicated information about a huge range of characteristics. So not just disease traits, but non-disease traits as well. And a lot of the information that could be provided through this technology would likely be probabilistic. And not just probabilistic, but also stretched across a wide range of human characteristics, potentially anything that's biologically based, any human characteristic that's biologically based. So it won't be diagnostic necessarily, but it'll give you probabilities of different possibilities for fetuses. This wealth of or flood of information will also contain a lot of information potentially about genetic variants of unknown significance. So genetic differences, clinical geneticists don't know whether it's significant, whether it's disease causing, whether it's not, whether it's benign. And there's also likely to be a lot of disagreement amongst experts about the significance of these differences. And also there'll be information, and to some extent we can already test for this, but it might be more common for people in the prenatal period to have access to carrier status information. So this is information about genetic traits that you yourself or your offspring or your future child might not have, but will have the ability to pass on to their future children. So you can see that this is a huge bunch of very complex different types of information that could be available through this technology. So some of the sources of complexity that I see with providing this information in the prenatal period. Is it accurate? So, and this is sort of very basic consideration, because if you look at NIPT right now, for rare genetic differences, it's really inaccurate. If you've seen for instance, on the New York Times, a few months ago, investigative reporters basically did a systematic review of NIPT for rare genetic differences, and they found that this technology is just really not very good. It's basically a junk test for a lot of kind of rare genetic differences that they're already testing for. So if you increase the amount of information that's provided through something like NIPT, you kind of wonder how accurate is it going to be. And sort of on top of that, another layer of this is, like, even in addition to the accuracy or lack thereof of testing, it's going to be probabilistic information in a lot of cases. So you might be provided with information along these following lines. Your baby has a 15% chance of developing X. So whatever characteristic you name it. Now, if 15% chance, that number I've kind of chosen because it's hard to interpret. Is that a high chance? Is that a low chance? It's roughly 1 in 6. Is it meaningful and so anybody receiving this information is going to require a lot of help interpreting what it means. And along those lines as well, another layer of complexity is interpreting what it means. So here's a quote from an ethicist and a genetic counselor who say that among clinical geneticists, the pathological or benign nature of a genetic variant is frequently a matter of whom you ask. So lots of complex information, and even experts disagree oftentimes on what it means. So all of this could be provided through technology such as non-invasive prenatal whole genome sequencing. So another technology that I want to mention, already available as a commercial product, polygenic scoring. So if you're going through IVF, for instance, assisted reproduction, you're given the option of genetic testing for the embryos that you've created through IVF. Polygenic scoring allows you to give sort of probabilistic, again, information about the likelihood of different embryos developing certain traits after birth. So these are based on genome-wide association studies that examine correlations between genetic variants and different traits. So even something like height, which is actually a pretty complex trait. Most variants themselves have only a very small effect on a complex trait like height. But if you add up these effects across the genome, the effects of variants across the genome can predict phenotypes based on genetic profile. So again, this is a technology that aims to provide probabilistic information based on the huge flood of information from genetic testing. So just to summarize, so there's kind of two things that I want to point out here that kind of pull in different directions, but also they kind of, to me, they also point similarly in another sense. So first of all, there's, as I mentioned, a potential complex flood of information. But there's also technologies that can be used to make predictions in some cases on this complex flood of information. And so what I want to suggest is that prenatal testing in the near future is changing and is going to change. And because of these changes, I think there's new ethical problems that we're going to have to contend with. And along with these new ethical problems, I think these issues might get us to think differently about prenatal testing for something like Down syndrome. What I mean is, I'm speaking about restricting access to genetic information. And I think because of the huge flood of complex information that's going to be available, we're going to have to restrict access to genetic information in some ways, just because we have to, because nobody can actually make sense of this complex flood of information. And some of the reasons we might have to justify restricting access to genetic testing in various ways, we might come to realize that they actually apply to restricting access to genetic information for things that we already test for, like Down syndrome. In other words, we might realize that what we're doing right now is actually ethically kind of questionable. And so that's the flood of genetic information. I think the things like polygenic scoring and the technology that's used to make probabilistic predictions about the lives of future people, this, even though it helps make predictions, interpreting it, all the problems with interpretation are not going to go away. And so I think there might be ethical reasons for restricting access to these technologies, or at least the information that they provide, in different ways. And again, because of that, we might come to think differently about testing for things like Down syndrome. Okay, so moving on to thinking about restricting access, there might be a number of different reasons for restricting access to prenatal genetic information. And ethical reasons are among them. But there's also reasons for restricting on the basis of low quality information if it's just not very accurate. We might want to prevent people from having access to it. Or if it's information that just seems trivial, doesn't provide very much insight into the probability for a different trait, even if it's a trait that people want to know about. And what's interesting about this is when you read some of the proponents of having like really easy, wide access to prenatal genetic information, even in light of new technologies, even the most liberal, sort of permissive people defending a very permissive position, even they recognize that there's going to be some reasons for restricting access, at least to some genetic information. And I've included these as overlapping because there might be overlap between ethical reasons and reasons about quality control of the information and reasons and similar reasons like that. Now, drilling down exclusively on ethical reasons. So there might be a number of ethical reasons for restricting access to prenatal genetic information. And I'm sure you've heard these in various forms. So not allowing access about non-disease traits, for instance. So refusing, to further projects of enhancing babies, or refusing access because the traits that people want to know about are trivial. So we're going to avoid, this might be the position that we want to avoid designer babies, bespoke babies. And the third one is the topic of this presentation. Restricting information that furthers or encourages participation in discrimination, for instance, against people with disabilities. And there might be other ethical reasons here. This isn't meant to be like a comprehensive list. So a little bit by way of further context, when we're talking about restricting access to prenatal genetic information, oftentimes the discussion is about not so much about the information itself, but restricting access to acting on that information. So restricting access to abortion in various ways. So we see this with the Crowter case. And as well, similarly, though in a different venue, American laws restricting access to abortion because of prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome. So Ohio and South Dakota and other states have laws like this on the books. So that's not really what I'm looking at here. I just want to mention that I'm examining the ethics of this option of restricting access to the results of genetic testing in various ways. And when I say restrict, I just want to sort of highlight that I don't necessarily mean unilateral prevention of access. There might be ways of making access available only on request, or having sort of standard kits of screens for people that they can choose from, different ways of nudging away from access to information that might be considered discriminatory. I'm leaving that option open here, but so restriction is meant to be, restricting the results of testing is meant to be, at this point anyway, in my own thinking, is meant to be broad. I'm not really insisting on any type of restriction at this point. So just along the lines of polygenic scoring, came across this article from a few years ago where this company, Genomic Prediction, is offering polygenic scoring as a commercial product that can be used to screen out embryos, and this is their language, likely to have, quote, mental disability. And another quote from that article: for ethical reasons, genomic prediction won't help parents select high IQ embryos. I have questions about this, ethical reasons for not selecting a high IQ, but seeing it okay as, to screen out disabilities. And, the implication is that there aren't ethical problems with that. Obviously, I disagree with that position. The point I want to make in relation to this is that it's interesting that genomic prediction is, in this regard anyway, self-regulating. So they themselves, as an industry providing this information, they're setting limits on what information they want to provide to customers. And if you read the article, incidentally, Lynn Murray is quoted in this article. If you read the article, it's interesting that even though they articulate this ethical boundary for the information that they want to share, that they want to provide customers, there are experts quoted in the article saying that, well, if genomic prediction doesn't provide this information to customers and customers want it, then some other company is going to do it. So even though there's sort of this self-regulatory position right now, or at least 2018, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to hold. So this provides a little bit of insight into the different groups that either produce or hold this information or have control over it in some way. And this indicates different venues for limiting access or restricting access to prenatal genetic information. So we shouldn't always sort of jump to the conclusion that the way to do this is through legislation or through court actions. Of course, those are options. So there may be laws against providing some forms of information. There may be legislated limits on public funding for certain tests, for certain conditions or characteristics or what have you. So, and limiting public funding, again, doesn't totally eliminate access to that test, but it certainly nudges away from people accessing that information in a routine way. So court actions, human rights challenges, or for instance, administrative law challenges, inconsistency with legislation. And professional groups, I think, is an interesting case here. So you can imagine a scenario in which certain professionals, physicians, midwives, genetic counselors, adopt practice guidelines that that suggest it's unethical to share genetic information about conditions or characteristics X, Y, Z. I actually think that this is where a lot of the action is amongst professional groups and the development of practice guidelines and these sorts of things. Even though, but I mean, that's the upside of it is recognizing that there's potential to influence practice in these areas. But out of all the four that I've listed here, this is probably the area where there's the least amount of input by the public, which is kind of interesting and kind of difficult if you want to change clinical practice. It's difficult to think about how to do that if you're not yourself a member of one of these professions. And that's because of professional self-regulation, I think. And I've mentioned industry decisions. Industry could adopt self-regulatory decisions to limit access to genetic information, or they can be pushed to self-regulate on the basis of consumer protest, potentially. So now getting back to more the ethics side of restricting access to information, I want to sort of propose that, I mean, it's actually pretty ethically complicated. And that's because, and other speakers so far have already alluded to this, that limiting access to genetic information, you're talking about limiting access to people's own information or information about their own fetuses or embryos. And this is challenging because of, obviously, the principle of respect for reproductive autonomy. Now, what that means is that if you're going, this is a balance here, if you're going to make an argument for restricting access to prenatal genetic information for some reason, or on some grounds, then it has to be a very important social goal in order for this to outweigh the kind of default position of respecting reproductive autonomy. And there must be a really high standard of proof that what you're doing is actually going to be like an effective way of addressing discrimination. But even so, even with that said, there are still, I was mentioning professional groups, there are professional groups that actually think it's, you know, pretty intuitive, pretty obvious that we need to restrict access to prenatal genetic information in various forms. So if you look, going back to 1994, the US Institute of Medicine said that genetic information should not be provided for minor conditions or in 2007, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists came out in opposition to prenatal testing for sex selection. Since then, it's interesting, the practice guideline that they released in 2007 has been rescinded, and I think they have a more nuanced position, but it is interesting in itself that back then, at least then, they did recognize that prenatal testing for sex selection is problematic, and for discrimination reasons. And if you look at 2011, 2015, there were surveys of OBGYNs and genetic counselors, and the conclusions that these professional groups reached in those surveys was that they're generally against the use of prenatal genetic information for determining non-medical characteristics. So even though, just to summarize, even though there is this strong presumption in favor of respecting autonomy, nonetheless, there are reasons and groups that are well-informed and interested in this topic who they often come out against sharing genetic information for some reasons. Now, a little bit of a thought experiment. So what about, consider 3 different characteristics for that could be determined through prenatal testing, or at least probabilistic information could be provided for these 3 different characteristics. So should prenatal information be restricted when intended to determine the likelihood that the fetus will develop obesity, or the likelihood that the fetus will develop autism, or the likelihood that the fetus will eventually be born and grow up and be gay, homosexuality. So I've chosen these 3 characteristics because, first of all, there's reason to believe there's some genetic basis, at least some genetic contribution for developing any one of these. I think there's research for all 3 supporting a genetic contribution anyway. And, it's not going to be determinative genetic information. It's not going to be diagnostic, but it'll be probabilistic. So if you have prenatal whole genome sequencing and polygenic scoring and genome-wide studies that correlate certain variants and add them all up, and you can have probabilistic information that your fetus will develop any one of these characteristics. And the other reason for choosing these 3 is that in the case of homosexuality, for instance, it used to be medicalized. It used to be considered a psychiatric condition, and gone are the days, that was long ago, we no longer view it that way. But there's sort of similarities with autism and obesity, because in both of these cases, advocacy groups, activist groups are really making the case that we should demedicalize them. So in the case of obesity, obesity activists are making the case that we shouldn't understand obesity as a negative health trait. You can be healthy and have obesity at the same time. Similarly, the neurodiversity movement with autism, people with autism and their supporters, making the case that autism should be understood as an instance of typical normal human difference. So medicalize, either demedicalize or cases of characteristics that are on the cusp of demedicalization, or people are making the case against their medicalization. Now, I want to mention that, if you look at the ethics literature, not everyone is uncomfortable with using prenatal genetic information for these uses. Some people will embrace them, but there are those who are uncomfortable for using one or more, for the use of genetic information to detect one or more of these characteristics. And when they are uncomfortable, I suspect it's because of worries about discrimination. So, and sex selection is another example there. People oppose sex selection because they're worried about misogyny. and people are opposed to genetic testing for homosexuality because of worries about homophobia. And what I want to suggest is that when there are these worries about discrimination, often the same arguments apply to a condition like Down syndrome. And so I want to explore that idea a little bit. So where I'm going with this, on the one hand, there are some who advocate no restrictions on prenatal genetic information. And I think there are ethical merits to that position. On the other hand, there are those who advocate restricting prenatal genetic information in some ways, sometimes limited, sometimes more broadly. But I want to suggest that in those cases where there's opposition to access to prenatal genetic information because it's discriminatory, I think that those arguments extend equally to something like genetic testing for disabilities, for Down syndrome in particular. So what's key here is medicalization. Usually when you see, the most sort of clear cases of legitimate access to prenatal genetic information is when we're talking about diseases, or things that are pathological, things that have a clear medical diagnosis. And when you see questioning of access to prenatal genetic information, when it's seen as legitimate, that's usually because the things that those who oppose it are opposing it for the uses are non-medical uses. So you see opposition to, again, examples such as sex selection, enhancement, designer babies, and I think some of the opposition based on non-discrimination also falls into this category. So, and there's a lot more that could be said, and I'm just sort of laying the groundwork for an argument right now. But people, advocacy groups, activists, self-advocates in the Down syndrome area have been making the case that Down syndrome should be understood as a non-medical characteristic. So, but there's still this belief that it is a medical characteristic. So it falls into this kind of gray zone or middle ground, along with other conditions, where it's seen as, on the one hand, partly medical, on the other hand, partly non-medical. And the position that I want to move to or explore is the idea that if you understand Down syndrome primarily as a non-medical condition, a characteristic, that's just an example of normal human variation, and you move it away from the medicalized sphere, then the argument becomes much stronger that genetic testing for Down syndrome is actually questionable because it's discriminatory, along the lines that we see for genetic testing for things like other non-medical characteristics or other things that that groups are arguing are not medical characteristics. So that's the kind of argument I'm laying the groundwork for, and yeah, so that's really all I have to say in a kind of contextual exploratory way at this point. Here are my sources that I've cited so far in this in this presentation, and I'd like to thank you.